I'd like to invite our panel up to the stage. Peter Baer from Climate Wire, long history with the Washington Post, is going to be our moderator today, and I'm going to turn it over to the panel and let Peter introduce the panel to kick us off today on deployment. Thank you again for all being here, and enjoy the day.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, as we've been told, as we know, to the third day of GridWeek. Please welcome this panel I'm about to introduce, who are not just thinking about the future of the smart grid, they are doing it. In the past two sessions, we've kind of looked out into the future and centered on the hopes and the concerns that lie out there. And my list of questions is short, but you know, we can ask whether there'll ever be a consistent set of federal policies impacting the smart grid. Will the Energy Department's tech grants or technology itself create a self-sustaining expansion of the smart grid? Will the smart grid pilots and demonstrations succeed in persuading skeptical state regulators that this is a future that they have to embrace? And most of all, how might consumers be engaged in the smart grid and persuaded to enlist in the conservation and the demand response programs that the smart grid enables? And fortunately, that question, I think, has been answered. How do you sell the smart grid? Well, Dan Yates, the founder and CEO of O-Power, told us yesterday, and for those who weren't in Auditorium B, I'll just quickly say what his formula was. Smart meters, he said, is like flossing. It's good for you. It saves you thousands of dollars. It saves you a lot of tooth pain, and you get to have most of your teeth when you're 80. Well, now look at the smart grid. It's good for you. It's relatively painless, and it saves you lots and lots of money over time. So if you like to floss, you'll love the smart grid. So there's the slogan. That can't miss. So the challenges of the future, of course, are concerns to our panelists this morning. But you'll be hearing from them about the present, about deployments that have begun. And we're lucky to have a panel of experts whose careers and whose companies span the whole spectrum of smart grid deployment. These are true first movers who have put capital, serious capital, precious talent, and in the case of the power cooperatives, their bond ratings on the line to begin this deployment. So please, with me, welcome, I'll just do this in alphabetical order. We're not seated that way, but Paul DiMartini, the Chief Technology Officer and Vice President for Smart Grid Strategy at Cisco Systems. Market cap is $131 billion. And there's Paul down there, second from the end. Linda Jackman, Group Vice President of Oracle Corporation by way of Australia. There's Linda. David Moore, Executive Director for Energy and Power of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, whose members are far out in front on smart meter deployment. Mark Mundy, the President and CEO of Elster, down at the far end, and the inventor, we learn, of the ABB Alpha Meter, way back in 1992, which was a true forerunner of advanced metering. Elster has 200 million metering devices in 130 countries and is engaged in some of the leading North American smart grid projects. And last but not least, Blake Young, the President and Chief Executive of Converge, a pioneer in demand response programs, which has 5 million devices on the grid, and a GridWeek director. So these companies and their peers are lining up for Dave Moore's co-ops and utilities represented in this room as partners and possibly in some cases as rivals. What do they see in the smart grid? What deployment lessons have been learned? What surprises have they encountered? What things that go bump in the night? And I'd like to start with Mark. Lessons learned? There's the button on the... Mark, excuse me, now you got it.
Sorry. One of the things I think people are learning, and one of the things that makes this such an interesting space, forgive me for a minute, I want to go off on one of the things Chris mentioned a bit, is smart grid's a religion, right? We all have our religion. And I think part of the complexities of smart grid is it's really a journey. And that's the frustration. You have the endpoints that we need to define, the steps along the way that we start to feel that we have accomplished things. But I think one of the frustrations is smart grid's not something we're going to get to an endpoint and be done. It's something that's going to continue to move throughout at least my career and lifetime, and I think through everybody's that's in here. And when you look at something this massive, something that doesn't have this clear definition, there is no wonder there are a lot of surprises and learnings as people start to deploy. And some of these things are just very detailed issues. And I think that's one of the big learnings of people who have actually gone out and deployed is the devil truly is in the details. And I think up front, some people have gone into it thinking, I can make assumptions, I can rule this out, I think everything's fine here. And what they really need to do is pay attention to everything. Assume nothing. Pay attention to the details, empower the detailed people to move those points forward and to address them. Because otherwise, that's when you run into the surprises and the issues that prevent these things from moving forward. This stuff can be as simple as a learning that people came up with is when I'm deploying, if I continue to put out non-AMI devices, then I'm going to have to pull those out in a couple of months. So I need to be able to install AMI devices, smart grid devices, up front while I'm rolling out my system. And that actually has complexities on the actual technology and what you select and how you deal with it. So something as simple as that, detail, can actually drive changes in what goes on with the system. There's mountains of data that have to be dealt with. That's a complexity in how one takes that and turns that into information. The consumer experience at another end, basically what smart grid means. At the end of the day, just learning what does it mean to me, my utility, my objectives, that evolves over time. So there's a breadth of detail here that has to be covered. In general, I think some of the surprises that have popped up in the industry have been things like the PUC skepticism. And I think some of the things that the utilities are seeing is a need to have a very broad business case that doesn't put all the eggs in one basket. They have a number of ways to get to the business case, which for many is a challenge, but I want to get to that point in a second. There's a huge number of variants that I think people are learning. So as you start to look at, I have to cover off all my applications, all the things that are going on within my utility, even if you go to something as simple as measurement to be able to do the residential and all the variants of CNI, and as these utilities have been put together, all the variants of product, that's a huge issue. And to know that's covered up front or you miss major business drivers. Well, and forgive me, I am a vendor here, but it's a general statement. Not all vendor claims are true. Sometimes very few of them are. So you have to have a way to weed through that and find out what is real, what is Memorex, to borrow from a very old commercial, to know how to take this stuff and to move it forward. The other thing that I think people are learning is that scalability can't be assumed. And actually, it can't really be piloted. So to know those things and to put in place a mechanism to allow that growth and the checking on that scalability, or to know the systems already can do that, is very important. If you look to Elster, as mentioned, our customers have millions of units deployed. They've been doing TOU billing. They've been getting low-profile data posted to their consumers every day. They've been using distribution automation for years, service switches since 2005. They have a lot of experience and have already deployed this and are getting some benefits. So let me give you a couple of those. One is when you look that these systems actually can go in easier than thought if you pay attention to the details. Most of these utilities are very pragmatic, dealing with every detail, very concerned about their customers, and hit that in a minute. The other piece they're learning is the distribution rules of thumb really aren't very good. that there are lots of holes in the distribution system. If you can get out and measure those things and optimize that distribution system, you can get huge savings. And that actually feeds to the next one, which is the operational benefits, once you actually go out, are much bigger than anyone's willing to give you credit for. That they can actually go in and see huge savings there. And then if you take and manage that consumer experience, and that's very difficult because consumers can be very fickle, but if you manage that, you can actually have very positive consumer experiences. Some of these utilities are winning the J.D. Power award for customer satisfaction. So I would hit those as just a starting point.
Paul, let's go to you. Lessons learned and surprises from deployment. You've tackled that in several top-level positions, so tell us about your experiences.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, recently I joined Cisco Systems from Southern California Edison, where I ran the Smart Grid program there for a couple of years, and looking very broadly from electric vehicle adoption and integration with the electric grid across to transmission, substation systems, and of course distribution and smart metering. And prior to that, started up and ran the smart metering, the very successful smart metering program that's still underway in terms of deployment. And certainly at Cisco Systems, leveraging the significant learnings in terms of deployment of large-scale systems in a number of industries, supporting Department of Defense, the financial services industry, and many different, the telecommunication service providers, et cetera. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned for sure. I think that I would say in general there's about 4 significant areas, some of which I'm going to reinforce some points that were made on the video and some of Mark's comments and others that I'm sure we'll be discussing today in total. I think it starts with planning. It's very important. I mean, one of the principles in project management, and deployment is around project management, and I haven't heard that word yet today, but it is a very significant project, and really not just a single project, but a program. And so understanding those principles and applying them very effectively is important. Probably the number one is planning. There's an expression that's used in project management that you can apply the Pareto principle. That is that 80% of the project risk can be addressed if you spend 20% of the time focused on planning. And I think that's exactly something that people should really think about, is that, and to take advantage of that planning time and have it very structured to be able to address the issues that Mark talked about. And we think at Cisco that it starts with business architecture and then linking that closely to technology architecture. And what I mean by business architecture is need to start with the objective in mind, and we heard that this morning. So what are we trying to accomplish with whatever program we're looking to deploy, whether it be smart meters, whether it's synchrophasers, whether it's teleprotection, whether it's substation automation, distribution automation, or a combination of those, as we're seeing with some of the demonstration projects that are funded as part of the stimulus. But what is the objective? And it's not just what is the objective for the utility, as Mark touched on and many of us have been living for the last couple of years, it's what's in it for the customer. At the end of the day, the ratepayer is paying for this investment, and so it's important for all of us to understand what's the value proposition for the customer. And certainly there are other stakeholders and societal benefits that are part of this value proposition as well. This business architecture, though, from the outset, often I've seen projects that people start a project and don't really know how they're going to use it all. Now, it's not clear that you could sort of forecast what the new business models might be over the next 10 to 15 years, but spending some time in the planning process to look out there, look a little farther, stretch the thinking, because often when you're talking about the investments that we're describing and the size of them, not thinking broadly enough can really get you boxed into a solution that isn't going to last from either a functional obsolescence issue or even potentially technologically obsolescence issues. And that's where start to tie into the technology architecture. And there we're really trying to address the issues that we've discussed here. That is scalability, interoperability, and security. And you don't do those during deployment. You solve those problems up front in the planning period. You think about those in the technology architecture. You think about applying modular techniques. You look at very scalable architectures. You address this, what could happen, where might you go in this journey over a 10 or 15 or 20 or even perhaps beyond that? How do you think about those marrying of fast cycle technologies like telecommunications can be in some realms with slow cycle technologies like a circuit breaker or a transformer or a meter? You're not going to touch those meters very often. And so how do you think about modular architectures that allow you to have what we all agreed upon 3 years ago with smart meters? You need to have firmware upgrade capability, where we're now talking about in smart metering that you need to have full IPv6 capability to leverage the functionality that's been developed on the internet to be able to assure that you can have some flexibility in terms of how you manage the system, how you deploy the system, how you operate the system down the road. These sorts of concepts are important during the planning period to think more broadly. I think to your point, Mark, what I see in the testimony and the decisions coming back from some of the commissions is that they're questioning, have we really thought broadly and deeply enough about what we're deploying in terms of the hundreds of millions of dollars, in some case billion-plus dollars? It certainly was the issues that I faced on the witness stand as the policy witness on the Southern California Edison smart meter case, was have we thought deeply enough about what we're doing and what we're deploying over a 20-year horizon to be able to sustain this over some period. So it's very important. I think as we get out of the planning and into deployment, testing, one of the single biggest cost drivers on a project during deployment is integration costs. Up front, you know what your meters are going to cost because you do a contract and those are set up front. You understand what certain pieces are going to be cost because those are set up front in terms of deployment costs and like if we're talking metering or in others in terms of you do a turnkey. The one area that seems to be a concern, and certainly if you look at what's the experience of a number of deployment projects, it's around integration costs. And this, I think, is where, in my mind, the NIST work on interoperability standards really comes to play. The reason integration costs are so much a part of these projects is because we don't have interoperability standards. We don't have modular architectures widely adopted in the industry. And as a result, the cost of integrating proprietary closed systems to each other is very expensive. Now, you're not going to get rid of all integration costs, but the point is that where most projects start to lose control of some of their costs or have cost overruns is in the integration. There are some areas where, because of testing or inadequate testing that was done pre-deployment, they may have missed some things that they could have caught during that. But that's easily solved. This other question about, so how do we solve the interoperability, I think is where the SGIP and the NIST efforts and why it's so important that all of us continue to participate to drive that forward. As we start to move towards moving product into the field, whether it's into a substation, into transmission, into the field in terms of smart metering, the customer engagement and helping customers understand what the value, understanding how this then interfaces, if it's upstream, if you will, into the into transmission substation. How does this then start to influence market design? Presumably, we'd have thought about that back in the planning stage and not trying to deal with market design to address a technology change that's being introduced. I think we have seen that a little bit with things like synchrophaser. We're deploying it from a sensing standpoint, but there are opportunities to leverage that technology for protection and control, adaptive teleprotection that can help resolve issues that might be inherent with intermittent renewable generation. And clearly there's a lot of smart people working and thinking about that, but wouldn't it have been nice if we thought a little more deeply about that a couple of years ago? We have opportunities for more technology that are on the roadmap to be thinking about that today in advance of where we want to go. And that, I think, comes to the last point, that increasingly a number of commissions have been asking for roadmaps. In California, Hawaii, and a few other places, there are now initiatives to look at 10-year roadmaps on how all of this is going to roll out. Because I think increasingly there's this understanding that there's a broader context. So how do all these puzzle pieces all fit together, and what is a logical sequence? Because you can't do it all. There is this journey, but there is, as it makes sense for most, to think about a sequence in terms of which to capture the value, that is the low-hanging fruit in terms of project deployed, and then increasingly over time add more and more functionality in terms of different areas. And it's going to be different for every utility because everybody's starting from a different place. There's a different set of context in terms of rate limitations, what the economy might be in that area, ability to raise capital, et cetera. But it's clear that we can start in many areas and start moving forward. And so that would be the last point, is starting to look at these deployment roadmaps and thinking about a logical sequence in terms of how the puzzle pieces fit together logically, and both from a technology standpoint.
Blake, you're next. Your lessons learned from kind of looking at this at the customer premises level and the household.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I think there are probably 2 or 3 things that come to mind listening to the other folks on the panel this morning. I think, Peter, you mentioned this morning that Converge has over 5 million devices deployed in the field that are a component of mass market demand response programs. In fact, the number's well over 5 million. I think that really isn't the big deal, because frankly, deploying and installing a digital control unit or an in-home display or a smart thermostat, all of the things that we've innovated around, at the end of the day, once you deploy 1 million, you can deploy several more million. So it becomes rope, soap, and dope. I think the more interesting challenge around the deployment of mass market anything is the level of infrastructure that needs to be integrated around that deployment phenomenon. I'll give you an example. Utilities come to Converge for lots of reasons. Obviously, the suite of hardware and technology that we've been building for decades is a big reason. But more importantly, it's not enough just to have one of these brilliant endpoints, as we refer to them in the company, deployed out in the field at a consumer residence. You have to, first of all, have the consumer in hand. And so we have a service that we offer as part of our demand response mass market initiatives where we enroll customers on behalf of the utility. How do we do that? We do that through direct marketing campaigns that we customize for every utility that we're working with. And so it's a specialized service to get the customer engaged, enrolled. In 2010, we've recruited over 200,000 consumers into demand response programs on behalf of utilities across the U.S. You deploy the device, you have to have infrastructure in the form of network control center that you operate and manage the load control program, and every load control program is different in terms of its characteristics and its behaviors and the intention. You have to have measurement and verification services that ultimately assure the utility and the customer that you can drop the load when called upon, and that you can demonstrate that in fact you performed per the agreement. And so for us, deployment has become much more of an integrated set of services and hardware that in total deliver the kind of capability and proven comprehensive results that you would expect in any mass market demand response program. And obviously you have to be able to do that for utilities across both commercial, industrial, and residential sites. I think the other learning for us has been that deployment must recognize that there is a legacy world that we're going to live with for a very long time. We are at an interesting juncture in our sector, in our industry, where we have had a unique stimulus regarding enormous investment in what is clearly the last dinosaur of infrastructure in the U.S. Despite the excitement of the investment, it's clear that the legacy that the industry carries will be around for a very long time. So our view of the promise of the smart grid takes into account the recognition that you can't forget about an enormous investment in AMR technology and the integration of that, obviously, with the new world. So we have designed our view to enabling the smart grid to capture the interoperability, as you point out, of both the old world and the new world, and it's an important aspect of how we deliver solutions. And I think last but not least, one of the things that I found very interesting in this week's GridWeek discussions is we have migrated, I think, from a conversation of just the infrastructure deployment around the grid to the management of the grid. What are the next generation applications and technologies and services that are going to be required to deliver the promise of all of this investment? And we see that as an information technology capability that is quite necessary in the management of the grid. And so we see the sum total of hardware, software, and services as an important aspect of deployment success moving forward.
Thank you. Linda, what excites Oracle about the prospects for smart grid development, deployment, and growth?
I think there's a couple of things that excite us, and I think I'll echo off a couple of other comments that the other panelists made. And I think Paul's point about the sequence of deployment is absolutely critical. I think there are applications today that exist today that move the utility forward, but I think there's also this sense of innovation from our side. And some of the things that we start to look at now are applications that a couple of years ago we weren't even talking about. Some of them are moving downwards from the transmission area, so dynamic load control and things like that. We look at those learnings out of all parts of the industry and we bring those forward. But then there's other things like microgrid master controllers and a lot of things around that side of it from an innovation perspective. But in order to get to the innovation, you've got to make sure that you're building on a foundation of applications that are ready to do what they need to do today. So whether that's real-time pricing, whether that's coping with the volumes of data that are coming into the utilities. One of our customers is looking at, as they roll out smart meters, a 300-fold increase in that data management issue. And so that's a data management issue, an analytic issue, a storage issue. And I think it was Mark that talked about turning that data into information. And I think that's one of the critical things that we look at. We don't know today what we need to know tomorrow. And I think as you design an information technology architecture, obviously we're dealing with it from completely the back office perspective. We're not out there rolling trucks and installing equipment. You need to understand that that architecture must be open. And I think that that's going to solve, or go part way to solve, the lack of standards. And I think that the key here is we can't all sit around and wait for standards. If we are, we're going to be Dan Yates waiting for all of us to floss. You know, and so it's really key that people start to move, but they move with a couple of things in mind. And I think Mark mentioned it and Paul mentioned it. Standards-based architecture. Do not accept proprietary technology. You know what that's going to do. If you think back, and some of you that are IT folks, think back 10 years ago when the first wave of ERP systems came out, utilities were one of those groups that said no standard package is ever going to suit us. You talk to utilities today, they wouldn't think about customizing or building their own general ledger. You buy a general ledger, whether it's from us or SAP. You don't think about that. So you need to think about that evolution cycle and that we will be there. The applications, and the two words have been mentioned already today, applications that integrate on a technology level but are interoperable on the desktop. You do not want your customer service agents logging out of one system and into another to look at meter reads and things like that. Those applications must be interoperable on the desktop. Your operations center guys must be looking at outage management data and distribution management data off the same data model. You must look at a single view of, whether it's a single view of the customer, whether it's a single view of the meter and all the events that are happening, or whether it's a single view of the network. You must actually understand and step back and look at that architecture. I think Paul mentioned it. Applications that are built with security as a foundation, not as an add-on. I think it's a really key thing for the whole industry to think about. We very much drive that philosophy. It's one of the key tenets of good IT practice. But I think there's a lot of applications out there today that are not built with that security in mind. You have to do it at the very start. I think Mark mentioned it, scalability. Like, you can't go from pilot to operation. You can't look at a pilot and go, okay, it's scaled for the pilot, and now we're just going to put it all into operations. We replace systems that have been tested thoroughly through the pilot. Absolutely. Everybody's looked at it, yes, given it the big gold seal, and it gets into operations, it doesn't scale. We're replacing systems where estimation routines don't estimate over the hour of midnight. And you just sit there and you think, who bought this system? Well, and it's embarrassing from an IT perspective, who in the community, the utility community, actually built a system that can't estimate over the midnight hour. And you sit, so be really careful and make sure you test, and I think, Mark, you mentioned it, you test all of the scenarios. And the big thing for us is this: talk to each other and learn what's actually going on. So scalability is really key. But I think the other thing is, and it was very much the focus of yesterday's panel, is everybody is thinking, smart meters are just all about time of use pricing and things that will impact the customer. And yes, they are, but that's only part of the story. It's about load forecasting and being able to better purchase power. It's about network design. It's about asset management. So I think the biggest lesson that we see from the utilities is understanding that smart grid is about the whole utility, and it's time to look at the utility and break down the silos that exist, the natural silos. All of you that work in utilities and work around utilities know those silos exist. This is an enterprise problem. This is a utility problem. It's an organizational problem. It doesn't belong to the meter guys. It doesn't belong to the guys in the substation. It doesn't belong to the back office. It belongs to everybody. And so our biggest thing and our biggest learning would be understand the process that spans the organization and bring all those players to the table to have that discussion.
Thanks, Linda. Our last speaker, Dave, represents the rural electric co-ops, and if you looked at FERC's first report on advanced metering a couple of years ago, you would have seen that the states that were way out in the lead in installation of advanced metering were not perhaps the ones you might have expected, but they were places where the rural co-ops and in some cases the munis are very strong, and they have a different relationship. They certainly have different needs that smart grid applications support, but clearly the front runners. And so I want to, Dave, ask you about that and perhaps what your members have learned that might persuade utility commissioners in other states about the value of the smart grid deployments.
Thank you, Peter. I think first it's very important to understand that that wasn't Dave saying that co-ops were leading. This was the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they said it not only in terms of AMI deployment, but also in terms of demand response. And there's a story there, but there's also a lot of lessons learned, and I want to talk about three of those in particular this morning. And the first, as consumer-owned, consumer-controlled, not-for-profit businesses, and we are private businesses, it's not surprising that if it reduces cost for consumers and increases the reliability for consumers, we generally do it, because that's in effect our business. So you start with if it benefits consumers, you do it. That's rule one. The corollary is also true. If it doesn't benefit the consumers, don't do it. So that, in a sense, is rule 1 and 1A. Second thing we learned is not everything that can be done by technology should be done. What utilities need, whether it's a co-op or whether it's Con Ed, they need to develop a plan, a technology plan that fits their business plan. Fits how the utility is going to move ahead, how the cooperative is going to move ahead to meet member and customer needs. The development of the technology plan, we think, is the key, because if you just accept the off-the-shelf package, two things will happen. You'll probably not get where you want to be, and secondly, it's going to cost you too much. So make sure you develop your technology plan and focus on what you want to do to meet your business plan. A third thing we've learned is, and you've heard it repeatedly from the other panelists here, this isn't about necessarily pricing religion. What this is about is making the grid smart. That includes optimizing the production, delivery, and use of electricity. So you don't want to focus on one and not the other. You've got to focus on the entire grid. Not surprisingly, where we serve, I always do the good news, bad news. Good news is we supply electricity in 75% of the land area in the United States. Bad news is there's nobody there. But what that means, practically, is where we have about 6 to 7 consumers per mile of line. So a typical co-op with 21,000 customers has to build a distribution line from New York to California to serve those customers. So it's not too surprising with that kind of geography, density, that when we can substitute electrons and photons for putting Joe and a helper in a truck and driving halfway across the country to find out where an outage is, we do it, okay? So we focus very heavily on those things that increase the productivity and efficiency of the power transmission and delivery system, distribution system, as well as the end use. So those things are very important to us. The example I gave, putting Joe and a helper in a truck, is one part of it. The other part, and we've been doing this for 30, 40 years now, despite the fact that some consultants say you can't do this, we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of customers who gladly accept a little switch on their water heater or on their air conditioner for $10, $15, $20 a month credit. And that switch is a direct load control device. And we use that how? We use it to basically hedge market risk in the wholesale market, which I think you all know is a very volatile market. So our focus, hedge the wholesale market risk to keep prices down, okay, increase the productivity and efficiency of the transmission and distribution system to keep costs down, and also increase reliability. So that, in effect, is our game plan and what we've learned. Now, 16.4% of our co-op customers have AMI already. We're investing another $600 million over the next 2 years, partially with the help of ARRA funds. Timing is everything in life. The timing was good here. But that's where we are. I do want to comment on a couple things that have been said. And one of the things that we think has been a problem in the smart grid community is that sometimes things get to be too much of a religion, okay? And I wasn't surprised at all when the BG&E application went in. The Maryland Public Service said, not only no, but hell no. The fact of the matter is, you're transferring risk to consumers, all right, and you expect them to pay for it, and I don't see the benefits here. You got to focus on where the benefits are to the consumer. Measure them, estimate them, and then decide whether you want to do this thing or not. So the religious part of it is a problem, and unfortunately, a lot of the religion is affiliated with the pricing policies, okay? Telling Grandma Abigail you're going to charge her $1.30 a kilowatt hour when it's 103 degrees out is not a real good idea as far as cooperatives are concerned, okay? We're using various forms of dynamic pricing, but the fact of the matter is, do something that clearly benefits consumers, and they will go for it, and I think we've proved that. One other thing I'll just mention, the 80-20 rule, we agree with that. As the Maryland PUC said, if you can get 80% of the benefit with 20% of the cost, okay, and you don't have technology risk, let's go there and then think down the road. So, sorry for the speech.
So Panelists, what do you think? Have we got too much religion about real-time pricing and connecting that to smart meter, advanced meter applications? Or is that ultimately dynamic pricing the way that we get the results in terms of conservation and efficiency that really are a primary goal of the whole operation?
My comment would be, I think when we say we have religion, I think everyone has their different concept that they grab hold to and want to hold tight regardless of the facts. And I think that's actually what David's proposing, is that you look at the real business case, the real benefits, the real drivers, and you make pragmatic decisions, not a religious married decision. And that's the comment about this is a path. You find the things you can do, you step through them, you knock them out, and you have a business. You have a business that pays back for the consumer, it pays back for the utility, for the stakeholders.
Well, I would agree with what Mark's saying, and certainly David raises a good point. I think that, to answer your question, I think there are two things to consider with this. One is that for places like California that got started on the path on dynamic pricing, it's important to kind of remember where that came from. That originally came out of the sort of post-mortem analysis on the energy crisis in California. And let's not forget, you had a utility go bankrupt, another one almost go bankrupt, and almost $12 billion get pulled out of the economy and out of ratepayers' pockets, in that market gaming that happened there. So not trivial amount of money, and it was in the post-mortem analysis that drove the dynamic pricing assessments, both for commercial industrial as well as for residential small commercial, was that with maybe as little as 5% and certainly with as much as 10%, probably could have, in terms of demand response on those peak days, could have avoided most of the market gaming that was going on and would have benefited customers very broadly, even having to maybe curtail or reduce and being exposed to some pricing. So the analysis after the fact, after the dust settled, was that dynamic pricing and allowing customers to get some visibility to what's happening in the market is probably a good thing. I think to David's point and Mark's, the devil's in the details. We do need to look at how best to implement that. But I think it was generally understood that this would be a good thing to do, and still is. I think the other piece that we've increasingly started to talk about over the last, I'd say, 6 years, is the recognition that our system generally in the U.S., as by the way, comparison to other parts of the world, is underutilized. And the system average load factor in many parts of the United States is 50%. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars of investment that are going in continually with infrastructure refreshment going on, largely because the infrastructure is now in many parts of the U.S. Approaching 40 or 50 years old at the end of its life cycle, much of which was developed after World War II with the economy booming. And by the way, this is no different than other parts of the world. Australia's going through this, Europe's going through this, the UK and Ireland are going through this. Everybody's seeing the same thing. The only difference here in the U.S. is our system average load factor is around 50%, and in places like Korea, it's just over 70. In other parts of Europe, it exceeds 70. That's why you don't hear demand response being talked about in some of these places. So the question is, do we get the most out of the asset investment that we're making? And this comes back to the customer question. So this also sort of indirectly adds value to the customer as well.
Dave, on one more swing at that, or
yeah, sure.
Blake, you coming in?
A couple of comments, real brief. I think there's a bit of an oversimplification. Either the perspective that it's either or on the context of differentiated rates and so on. I think for us, our perspective is some interesting dynamic pricing trials across the country. I think still early in the cycle, and I think the reality of that married with consumer-enabled energy efficiency driven through behavioral change a change in behavior of how we use energy is probably, where it's all going to flush out. I think regulators are clearly asking the question, what's in it for the consumers? And I think the easy interpretation of that is, the context of differentiated rates. And certainly that's an aspect of that, but there's a lot more to it. If you look at progressive states like Pennsylvania Act 129, where you've seen very dramatic moves in terms of encouraging energy efficiency and setting very specific demand response expectations, that's going to set a trend. It's certainly a state that's way out ahead of the game. So I think what we'll see is ultimately a melting pot of energy efficiency, behavioral change, context, in conjunction with the differentiation of rates to consumers that provide flexibility as opposed to something that is more mandated and thou shalt, And I think that's where we see the trend moving.
Peter, could I make an additional observation? I brought up the issue within the context of three of you talked about AMI, smart metering. And I was trying to make the differentiation with smart grid and saying, and where you serve your loads and other things have a very, it's different in different locations is a way to say it. What I was trying to get across is this total narrow focus on just dynamic pricing. Part of our research at co-op land, if you will, includes various forms of dynamic pricing. So we're not, we're certainly testing all those things. The key is, this is GridWeek, okay? This is about smart grid. And when we do the benefit cost analysis between system operating benefits and direct load control, just those two things, we can more than justify, in many, but not all cases, more than justify investment in smart grid technology. So the rate thing is an adder. We certainly agree that the more information customers have, the better.
Let me shift gears here just for a second on a different subject and ask any panelists that want to jump in on this, where are utilities going to get the bandwidth to handle this torrent of data that is required to really realize the potential of the smart grid?
I'm sorry, can I give
Sure.
one practical response, though, to the last one, which is if you look at and can get payback operationally in 2 years instead of 7, how does that change the way you look at the smart grid? And this isn't about the pieces. I'm talking about the grid, being able to get benefits. If you can measure and find that the voltage delivered is 6 to 8% high on the feeder, and I can get 4 to 6% energy savings with the consumer doing nothing by being able to adjust and control that, in my mind, that's huge. These are the types of things you can get if you have measurement control points out there, which is the infrastructure piece in AMI. It's not the metering point, it's the infrastructure piece that gives you that measurement and control to know what's happening on the side you're blind on. I'm sorry, I just needed the...
So anyone want to jump into the bandwidth question?
Well, I think that, just picking up where Mark left off and addressing your question is that I think as many of us are starting to look at this issue that you've raised in terms of the amount of data that needs to be analyzed and then processed in terms of then taking action on, and not just data for data's sake, but how do you start to then take use of it, is that it's important to start thinking more broadly about how to do that analysis, how to do that, those applications. And from our perspective at Cisco, and certainly this builds on work that done in the past and others are working on in the industry, is that it's going to be increasingly more distributed. So there's certainly a role at the back end to do heavy duty data processing and management, but for many applications, and going back to Mark's example, integrated volt-var control isn't done at the back office. It's done at a substation or out in the distribution system. And there are other applications that we're anticipating with the integration of distributed renewable resources tied in with community storage or of the like, and those are going to be done on a local basis, or even increasingly more advanced distribution applications for protection and control that isn't, I mean, today there are two forms of protection on, stopping fault current in a distribution circuit. One is a fuse out somewhere on a tap section, and the other is a circuit breaker. And I think where in more advanced applications that we're likely to see over the next 15, 20 years, and we're already seeing it in a number of demonstration projects, by the way, that are funded by the stimulus, are looking at having that protection and control operate intelligent vacuum interrupters essentially out on the distribution circuit so that the fault is cleared before and the circuit reconfigured before the circuit breaker even trips at the substation, so you can reduce the outage exposure for the customers. That level of sophistication requires a lot of data and analysis and processing that would never happen in the back office. It's going to be done. So I think where most of the architectures are looking today is on this distributed model, that there are pieces across this, and as a result you can start to pre-process data at certain points in the system so that not everything has to go back. But it is still going to be a fairly large number. Sorry.
Yes, I agree with Paul. I think that the key to this, the backhaul of the data, is going to be about it's going to be about distributed processing. So you're going to see a lot of work go into that whole substation automation side where that distributed process is going to happen at the substation level. And I think the backhaul of data is only going to be event driven. It's going to be, what are those critical events? Because the thing that's got to happen within the IT world is we've got to get down to predictive analysis. We've got to get down to starting to say, and starting to build some intelligence into the applications that pushes it forward, that says, we've seen these patterns before, do you want to take a look at this? And so that, and I don't want to go as far as calling it artificial intelligence, because that sounds like I'm a fan of Steven Spielberg, but it's got to start, the applications have to start to learn, and they have to start to get predictive, because otherwise you can't look at all that data. I think the second part about it is serving up that event-driven data in a way that makes sense to a utility. And a lot of the work that's gone into it is all around that spatial piece, is being able to serve up not only your safety KD indices, but serving them up and saying, these are the transformers or these are the pieces of equipment that are actually impacting that. So you get a visual representation as well as a static representation of the data. So I think those two things are things that definitely we look at in order to try and deal with this bandwidth issue, which I think is going to be a huge factor for the utilities.
The last subject I'd like to bring up is the question of what's really driving the smart grid deployment right now. There are a couple of obvious candidates. One is simply the technological capability is driving it in some cases. The ability to make the systems more secure, to expand the predictive capabilities, to find out what the parts of this aging infrastructure are in trouble and deal with that before it's a problem. We've had an unprecedented infusion of stimulus money into some very high-profile demonstration projects. That's possibly a driver. Whether Congress will continue to fund smart grid and clean energy initiatives in the future it certainly remains to be seen. And we know we have a political consensus in some states and regions that the smart grid is and clean energy is where they want to go. So let me ask each of you, what do you think the most important drivers of smart grid deployment are, and which are likely to be self-sustaining if the policy picture and the congressional support becomes unclear, or remains unclear? Anybody like to start in on that?
I would suggest that there are really three main drivers that are pushing this forward and will continue irrespective of what the policy direction is, because I think what policy can do is affect the rate of change, but the change is coming. And I would say that there are the convergence of three things that are driving this, that utilities are looking at, the policymakers are looking at, and certainly those of us in the technology product and service area are looking at. One is social networks. So whether we talk about, and sometimes we sort of have these abstract discussions about customers, but then we also, in sort of our everyday life, then talk about, Facebook and these other things. They're all together. So this world, in terms of what the utilities need to interact with their customers, is evolving very quickly into this social network, and people are increasingly talking about how to leverage that, understand it, and use it in the purpose of engaging customers more effectively on a number of dimensions in terms of providing more effective service, but also how to engage on energy efficiency, conservation, and demand response. So social networks, number one. Second is, it's clear that we've been on actually a century-long evolution. Ray Kurzweil did a backward analysis of Moore's Law, and it extends all the way back to the 1900s, actually the 1880s, and as a continuous progression of Moore's Law over that time period, that's not slowing down. So there's clearly innovation continuing and unabated in both communication technologies and other information technologies. That's not slowing. The other is in grid. As I mentioned, just to put a finer point on it, EEI in their most recent financial assessment back in the spring suggested over a 20-year period over the next through 2030, $1 trillion being spent on infrastructure by the investor-owned utilities in generation, transmission, distribution. And as I said, this is a worldwide phenomenon. With the replacement of all that infrastructure, it begs the question, do you put out the old stuff? And certainly I think increasingly what people are saying, and this goes to the journey piece, is when you change it out, you're going to put in the newer things that will have inherent in them this more modern information communication technology coincident with it that will support this other layer, which is the social networking aspect, and what that means both for the customer base, but also stakeholders and how utilities think about operating themselves. Let's not forget that 50% of the utility industry is going to turn over the next decade in terms of retirement. So you have another dynamic going on there in terms of the convergence of these different cultures that Chris talked about in his opening for this panel. So all of this is converging at the same time.
Yep.
I think when you look at a lot of the regulatory drivers that we're all aware of, I think many of those are sustained. I mean, there is a question, where's the energy come from in the future? There is the question of, can the transmission system support it? So a major step has to be doing things better, smarter, faster. I mean, we can't just keep building without doing it in a better, smarter, faster way. The other piece is what David and the panel has been discussing is it's got to bring pragmatic, practical solutions to society, to the consumer, to the utility, and those will be the things that will continue it forward. And there's a huge opportunity given the lack of visibility of the low voltage distribution network to go in and to be able to put the distributed intelligence to enable these types of capabilities and to get that efficiency gain, and then to enable the consumers to move forward. I think those drivers are there. And we can't overlook that the governments just drive things. I mean, the EU, the edicts in 2020 on gas and electric, I mean, those things will continue to move forward and put excitement in the space, competition for me, as it goes forward.
I agree with everything my co-panelists have said. Maybe just a couple other observations. I think, there's clearly an overlay of sustainability that's not going away. It's getting stronger. A significant majority of customers we recruit to demand response programs in the mass market are those that are quite sensitive to a cleaner planet, a greener environment, and that's part of what makes these programs a success at the rate that they have been. Secondly, obviously the more efficient use of capital across the board, we're in a hole that's going to continue to be a deep one to dig out of, and I think that bodes well for the increasing complexity of the grid and leveraging that complexity. And then lastly, and it kind of touches on what Paul just pointed out, it's really the velocity of change that we're experiencing and seeing. I mean, the increasing complexity, it's not just a demand variability problem anymore, it's a supply variability challenge, with the presence of renewables on the grid, and we could debate for some time, what percentage contribution renewables will have to the total supply mix. That's really the irrelevant part. The point is renewables are here to stay. Demand response is a critical component of the energy mix, and so the velocity of change and complexity, I think, is clearly a contributing factor too in the conversation.
Linda.
I think it's only seriously about one thing, and it's about reliability. Can we just sit for 3 minutes and think about life without electricity? And at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about reliability of supply, being able to incorporate renewables into the grid, and the volatility that that brings to it. You only need to go to Northern Ireland and talk to the guys there about the variability of wind and the fact that they have to slow it down, and that there's a whole set of new technology that needs to be developed around the incorporation of renewables. I think it's about the aging asset, and I think we've talked about it. We all thought we could retire recently until our 401ks turned into 201ks. And I think that aging asset, aging infrastructure issue is still out there, and I think that's what makes it sustainable, and what makes it, because you've only got a limited amount of capital to spend, and you're going to have to understand from the technology or from the information that's coming in from the grid which assets get replaced first, what the priority is, what's the risk, how do you look at your customers and say what asset gets replaced before another one, because it's not we can't do everything together. So I think it's all about just this concept of reliability, because we can't imagine Paul mentioned Facebook. Can you imagine Facebook without, you can't do Facebook without electricity. I think it's the life-sustaining force, and I think that's the key to the whole thing.
Or Anchorman.
Are you sure on that Facebook thing? I may have a different opinion there, but that's, I just want to make, I'm agreeing with everybody here, because I think they've all touched on things that are important, but I also think it's important to understand how it's happening at this particular point in time. I'll show my age a lot and go back to 1975 when I was at a place called ERDA. Anybody remember ERDA, Energy Research and Development Administration? It was part of the Department of Interior, and we and the Electric Power Research Institute did some of the first studies on the use of bidirectional communication and control for the optimization of the production, delivery, and use of electricity. The ideas were there, and certainly we didn't dream them up. You can probably go back 50 years before that. We called them different things. It was advanced distribution automation, it was load management, big term back then, wide area network optimization. We talked about all those things. What's different today? Well, some of the needs that everybody here has identified certainly are true. But a couple other things, interestingly, from a technology standpoint. Lower costs, increasing availability and reliability of broadband communication. Huge for what we're trying to do. Lower costs, much faster speed of distributed processing, data processing. Absolutely huge, particularly if we're going to unload the backhaul systems. And the creative invention of the unfortunately named IEDs, intelligent electronic devices, not the other ones. Those three things, from a technological standpoint, have given us new tools to solve an old problem.
So does it sound like then that the next bridge towards self-sustainability it starts out with the ability of the smart grid technologies to strengthen the grid, to make it more efficient, to make it more reliable, to provide better service, and this bridge carries it forward until the point when state commissions and consumers have reached a consensus that there's something in this for them. Is that kind of the model we're discussing, or do these things have to happen together?
I think for most cooperative members, that a lot of that's already happened. They understand. Again, when you live in rural America, these very low density, it takes a while to get to a repair an outage or do a trouble call. We had an interesting statistic, 48% of trouble calls were false positives. Go down and turn on your circuit breaker. These are hugely expensive when you put Joe in the truck, okay? So people see that feedback, they understand it conceptually. Gee, my outages go from 5 hours, because you don't have to drive 500 miles, okay, to 30 minutes. That's a huge benefit. So a lot of those very practical things our consumers understand. The other thing is we do have an advantage. As cooperatives, we're not for profit, they know that. If we accidentally make an extra buck, they get it back. So, and that is an advantage. But the other thing is it's going to be different. What you do in New York City with this is very different than in rural areas.
Maybe we have time, Paul, for one last comment.
So building on the comments there, which agree, I think the only other is that in many places, it's not a question of do you do them one at a time in serial fashion. It's a question of how much concurrently can you do, because we are trying to address a broad range of issues, and that's why we look in many places talking about smart metering at the same time we're talking about synchrophasers, which are really on some sort of bookend the whole spectrum here, and all the issues in between. So the question is really how many do you do concurrently and sort of a staggered, but it's pretty clear that in many cases there are positive benefits clearly for smart metering, and that's why they've moved forward, and certainly many of the things we talked about are fine to move forward today, and strong cases can be made.